Okay, so first of all, welcome colleagues to this evening's Mentor Twilight training session, which is a part of our mentor development program, which we have embarked upon from a grade one standpoint over the last couple of years. We've made some changes over that time, but one of them has been that we are keen to ensure that training materials and resources are obviously available to you asynchronously, but also that we're supporting school-based teacher educators with these twilight sessions, which are opportunities to revisit some of our key messages and key strategies as part of the mentor development program at appropriate points throughout the year. So obviously at this stage in the academic year, we have our PGCE student teachers who are on their professional teaching experience 2 in schools, both secondary and primary colleagues. So they are in school at the moment in the throes of their teaching experience, and hopefully some of the messages that you hear this afternoon will really support them and you in your endeavours in schools over the next 6-7 weeks of the PT that we have left. Just to point out that all of the materials that are being discussed this afternoon are available on SharePoint, and you'll have the link from handbooks and so forth. And I know a number of you have this favorited on your respective devices, but within the mentor development program area on SharePoint, you'll find not only the training from September, which is our full training offer, but also the slightly shorter training that we'll have this evening will also be there. I'm going to begin by talking about the role of the teacher educator, and I could spend the entire session talking about the role of the teacher educator, but at this point I think it's really important before we begin in earnest to begin to unpick what we mean by this term. So I just wanted to focus to begin with in something which Murray in 2009 described this role as, so being a unique occupational group with distinctive skills, knowledge and understanding. And I think that applies to everybody that's on this call, certainly, but also those mentors and teacher educators in schools across our partnership. The graphic that you can see on the right-hand side really brings this to life and helps to illustrate the difference between perhaps university-based teacher educators and school-based teacher educators, and is yet another illustration of the number of hats that school practitioners wear at different points. So obviously, first and foremost, they are working in schools, and you can see a teacher educator obviously at university typically works in the higher education sector, but also this first order approach in terms of teacher educators. You can see that the identity that is interwoven between working with children and then adult learners as student teachers comes through very, very clearly here. Now, that separation, if you like, those two different roles obviously requires two different forms of pedagogy to support student teachers is one thing, but also obviously your day-to-day job in terms of supporting learners in classrooms is something quite different. So they're two very different hats, and we know that the same approaches can't necessarily be used with both, but hopefully as we begin to talk through the training this afternoon, you'll see how we unpick that, particularly with regards to strategies such as lesson observations, where perhaps student teacher is observing you teach and you are having to wear these two hats at that same point. So just to take a step back ever so slightly, I'm going to reintroduce our key strategies and aims that underpin this mentor development program. And about 2 years ago, as part of our partnership days, which is where members of the partnership from across South Wales came together and identified dispositions and behaviours that we felt were demonstrated on a daily basis by mentors in the Athrova Professional Learning Partnership. And we've themed those in typical thematic analysis fashion into 3 key areas. First and foremost, we identified that our mentors have a role to play in guiding student teachers, and that might be through steering them through the complexities of the profession, for example, planning and classroom management and so forth, but also navigating the world of school life. And that's something that we think really comes through quite strongly in what we see in schools, and therefore what we want to ensure we support with our training. Secondly, we know that our mentors in the APLP provide consistent encouragement of their student teachers, perhaps through feedback, practical help to build confidence, and so on, but also to ensure that the student teacher, both from a pastoral sense and also as their role as a learner, is fully understood and supported in schools. And then finally, inspire. This is something which has come through very strongly over the last couple of years, and certainly at a time where teaching as a profession is something which at times can be portrayed in a particular way in the media. And it's really important that as mentors that we spark a passion, and as teacher educators, we spark a passion for teaching and lifelong learning through, for example, demonstrating enthusiasm and creativity and resilience. And again, that's something which you'll see come through very clearly in our training offer. I wanted at this point to draw your attention to something which is a rather busy slide, but also supports our vision. This is based on the work of Trevor Mutton, Professor Trevor Mutton, Oxford University, whose own depiction, or indeed the Oxford University's depiction of human mentoring, aligns very closely with ours. And I'm going to leave this on the screen just for a second, so please feel free to record this, to pause this recording to look at this. But I did want to draw attention to a couple of these bullet points, which again rings true and echoes with our own strategies and vision for mental development. So first of all, I wanted to focus on that third bullet point, the idea of the mentee as a learner, and an understanding that for student teachers who are perhaps having to demonstrate and learn through a fairly unique position as somebody who is leading learning whilst at the same time learning themselves, is something which is really quite difficult. So therefore, an understanding of that dual identity, making sure that they have the opportunity to flourish in their own way at particular points in the year is absolutely key. Also, the third to last bullet point, so on the right-hand side of the screen at the moment, I wanted to draw attention to this idea of creating imaginative and innovative practitioners, or supporting them to achieve those rather lofty ambitions, and then understanding how difficult that can be, not only in this year, and for example in their PGCE year, but also equipping them with those skills to develop that skill set over their career as they progress. So a really important point, and as I said, please feel free to pause and look at these and perhaps discuss them with mentors in your schools. There'll undoubtedly be things here which might relate to your own professional learning in schools as well. So please feel free, as I said, to make use of those. Right, the grade 1 offer falls into 5 sort of key areas, and I'll be talking through these this afternoon. The first of which equips mentors with an understanding of the importance of getting to know their student teacher from an educational perspective. So perhaps moving beyond the basics of personal circumstances and really getting more of an in-depth understanding of the student teacher's background, experiences of school, the ways in which they feel they learn well, and so forth. And I'll talk through some resources which support that. Secondly, we know that student teachers planning, and indeed planning more generally, is something which is a challenge. So supporting student teachers to plan effectively for learning in their school settings is a key feature of this training, and again will be discussed. We'll also be looking at supporting effective reflection. We know that the word reflection can be bandied around, and perhaps not always with an in-depth understanding of its purpose in the student-teacher development. So we'll focus a little more on that. Fourthly, we'll look at the use of lesson observation, which is what I was talking about earlier, particularly with your role as a teacher educator in school. But how do you make the implicit in terms of your practice in schools explicit to somebody who is perhaps observing that and not fully understanding what they're watching. And then finally, a brief section on feedback and supporting feedback and target setting in a way that gets the most out of this process, particularly at those summative points where perhaps formal targets are being set for student teachers. Okay. Again, just at this point, I'll pause in case anybody's got any thoughts, comments, or questions before I get into this first section around getting to know your student teacher. Okay. So I'm going to begin this section by leaving this quote on the screen. I'll just give a moment for colleagues to read this, but this really underpins why we attach so much significance to this idea of getting to know the student teacher. You can see that I've taken the liberty of putting some things in bold, but particularly with regards to the last half really of the last sentence. So understanding the emotional attachments, and obviously the language here suggests trainee, but student teachers might have to ideas and experiences that they had in schools to enable them to support their evaluating and relevance and meaning of teaching and learning in their current context. Now, student teachers do not come to this program or these programs with, or rather as empty vessels. At this point, it is more than likely they've had 18 years of their own education and life experiences, which has formed them in a particular way. And they will come to this program with very particular views on teaching and learning, both good and perhaps not always so good with regards to their own experiences. And indeed, this can play out. We know that it can play out in the way that they approach their own practice when it comes to being in schools. And this is something which is really important to unpick, not least because you as a mentor will be able to obtain points of reference, for example, to draw their gaze to as it goes through the program. And there might be opportune moments where perhaps you're seeing some of the behaviors that they've discussed in terms of their own experiences, but also at this point to offer you the opportunity to think about how your experiences of learning to become a teacher also feed into this idea of prior experience. Now, in order to support these discussions, we have produced a number of resources which hopefully you will find useful in supporting these initial conversations. So this is one of our mini guides in the bottom right hand corner, which again are available on SharePoint. But within this mini guide, you will see 5 or so sort of key questions that perhaps you can set some time aside. It doesn't have to be formally noted anywhere, but perhaps a cup of tea and a discussion about unpicking these types of questions. You'll see, for example, the third one, have you observed any lessons that are particularly effective? At this point in the year, the student teachers would have undertaken a full PTE already. So undoubtedly, they would have seen things that resonated with them that they found to be particularly effective. And at this stage, you might see that some of those things that they've seen in PT1, they might try and bring into PT2, which is obviously to be applauded and encouraged, but they need to be very careful about ensuring that they are using the appropriate skills and strategies in the classroom which fit the context they are in now. We don't want to produce student teachers that just mimic mentors that they might have, and they need to be aware of the context in which they're teaching. So these type of questions, as I said, help to begin those conversations. Elaine, I didn't know if at this point you had anything you wanted to add with regards to student teachers' prior experiences.
I think, thanks, Laurie. I think we all are trying to appreciate how they move from being a pupil in classrooms, that's their experience of education thus far, to being a teacher in classrooms. And they have to make that shift. And you will know better than us probably what that shift entails and what it looks like. But just even being aware that they need to make that move is important. Thanks, Laurie.
Thank you, Elaine. At this point, I'm going to move along to a document which is available in each of the student teachers' SharePoint folders, but it's something that we have used over the last 2 years and have found to really support student teachers' orientation into this mentor and mentee relationship. And it's a one-page profile, and every student teacher who comes to you will have one of these. And as you can see from the screen at the moment, it's a real reflective document, an honest document in which they reflect on their individual strengths, but also perhaps the reasons that they want to become a teacher. You'll be able to identify perhaps some of those attitudes that we've already discussed, but also how they feel they can support you in schools and the ways in which they can be supported themselves. We've seen typically that some student teachers have asked for very direct feedback. Some have craved a very sort of direct feedback approach, which might come from their own perhaps insecurity, if you like, and wanting very direct feedback, whereas others prefer to, for example, have written feedback in their learning journals, a means of developing particular areas for targets or whatnot. So again, please spend some time looking through this one-page profile to support your student teachers. They are available on their SharePoint folders and should really support you in supporting the student teacher. Okay, I'm going to move along to the next section, which is about student teachers planning. And it's really important at this point to join some dots between what the student teachers do on the taught side of the programme, so typically when they are with us in university, and then obviously when they come to you in schools. We know that there can be a slight gap between those two things, and we want to make sure that we're joining those dots as well as we possibly can. So first of all, you can see across the top in the rectangles our modules that we equip the student teachers with throughout the programme. And you can see that the first one, the orange one here, is what I'm going to be focusing on for the purposes of this discussion around planning. This module is called Leading the Learning, the what, how, and why am I teaching? And all of the circles that are dotted underneath are parts of that module and the things that are typically encountered by student teachers on this module. Now, in a nutshell, you can see from the content of those circles that this focuses in particular around, for example, curriculum, planning, the principles of planning, curriculum alignment, and so forth, AOLE knowledge as well. And this is really important that you know that they have this input with us at the university. The student teachers have obviously undertaken a PT or Resi, but we also spend a considerable amount of time supporting student teachers with an understanding of effective planning. And whilst we can't tell them that there is one way to plan for a learner, we can, of course, discuss principles of planning, which might include effective questioning, opportunities for assessment, and planning for misconceptions. So those are things that we discuss as part of this module to ensure that when they come to you, that they are able to adapt their practice to the context in which they are in. We know that student teachers, particularly at the early stages of their career, might struggle with particular areas of planning. It's a very complex thing. There is no obvious answer and right answer that they, as I said, can simply lift something off the shelf and it will work. And these are identified challenges which come through very clearly in literature and research. And it's important for us to understand them, and again, so that we can address them in our discussions with student teachers. So the first one, a lack of phronesis, which is a wonderful word, but essentially means practical wisdom. And in a way that perhaps more experienced practitioners are able to pick up lessons, whether that's pre-prepared schemes of work or otherwise, or something that they've used historically, but might be able to run with that and adapt in the moment and meet the needs of the learners in that way. That just simply isn't something that a very early stage teacher isn't necessarily going to be able to do to the same extent. And thinking back to my own experience of multiple post-it notes on the side of my whiteboard and everything else, because I'd planned so carefully, you might see this coming through as part of a student teacher's preparation for lessons. We also know that student teachers can occasionally not have a firm grasp of the big picture, particularly when it comes to regards to planning for progress over a longer period of time. They might well focus on individual lessons and learning experiences and feel as if that is their world at that point. And again, thinking, purely back to my experiences, that was something that I could resonate with. At the end of my lesson, as it was, I was very pleased to hand the class back to the class mentor, and I felt that I had done my bit, if you like. And we really need to work with student teachers to encourage them to lift their heads up and to think about what's coming next. How do they get the learners to this next stage of their learning? There might also be other challenges that facing student teachers. So whether that's subject-specific pedagogy that they needed to develop, either through observing other colleagues or different year groups, and also how they ensure that they're assessing learners' progress effectively, perhaps moving beyond fairly superficial assessment for learning techniques or strategies, and really thinking about what's coming next. So going back to my earlier point. Now, the ways that we can support this, we prepared this document, which is on the screen at the moment, which has a series of questions which we encourage mentors to use with student teachers. The student teachers have seen this too, as part of, for example, PPA sessions, and asking these questions almost as prompts as part of their planning process. Going back to my earlier point, there is no obvious way or one way to plan, but these type of questions can hopefully elicit some thinking around typically those challenges that I've just shared. For colleagues who perhaps are new to the APLP, you may not have seen these templates before, and this is something the student teachers use. It's our Throw Professional Learning Partnerships planning template. Much like others, and again, thinking back to our own experiences, might well have used planning templates in this way in the past. I'm aware that obviously things have changed, and now there's the advent of 5-minute lesson plans and so forth. But we really ask student teachers to use these plans to help mentally rehearse the learning experiences for learners, but also their own preparation of the lessons to ensure that it really encourages them to think deeply about that. At this point, I would like to point out that student teachers on the PGCE programme, once they get to the mid-placement point, which is the 7th of May, if they are on track for their standards, they can cease to use this template and move to the school-based planning processes, whatever those are in your respective contexts. As part of the lesson plan template, you will see that there is a section here with regards to supporting learners' Welsh language development. And this has been a focus for us at a strategic level this year, to move away from the idea that the use of incidental Welsh is almost tick boxy and that they include a Bore Da, and that's enough of an input when it comes to the use of language. And as a result, you will see that again, there are several resources on our SharePoint area which support this. So the document that you can see in front of you here is an example of a resource that student teachers could use to plan in maths and numeracy, for example, in a primary setting. And there are a whole host of resources which are available on our SharePoint area, which again, we encourage both you as mentors, particularly if the student teachers are coming to you with a target or an area for development around Welsh language, that can support in that endeavour. So I just wanted to finish the conversation around planning by signposting some of these other strategies, which we know are discussed widely in literature, but also from personal experiences as part of our partnership, have been valued experiences for student teachers. So the use of co-planning may seem obvious, but at this day and age where we know that many people have the opportunity to take their PPA elsewhere, so perhaps aren't actually sat next to the student teacher, but actually carving out time to discuss your thinking around planning and supporting the student teachers' thinking around planning is very key. Co-teaching lessons or team teaching lessons, again, is something that is really valuable for a student teacher to be part of that co-delivery of lessons, but also the use of focused observation. So as part of the planning process, if a particular area was identified as a challenge, for example, effective questioning, that the student teacher had the opportunity to observe more experienced colleagues with their use of effective questioning as part of the planning process. You'll see some other comments here around curriculum support. So whether that's helping them navigate the complex world of curriculum for Wales and identifying appropriate approaches, strategies, resources, and so on at the opportune moment, or really by asking them to reflect deeply on perhaps the more taught side of the programme where they're encountering theory. So whether that's Vygotsky or Piaget or anyone else for that matter, any other links to the modules that they've encountered that they can draw into their planning process. The aspiration here is very much that the taught part of the programme informs their practice in schools, and they're able to draw on that to inform their practice rather than it sitting in silos in two different spaces. I'm going to stop there just for a moment before I come on to talk about lesson observations, just to double check if anyone has any questions or comments at this stage with regards to planning. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to move on then to talk about observation. And at this point, it's important to note that this is with regards to student teachers' observation of experienced practitioners. Now, this image, which undoubtedly you would have seen before in a whole host of different guises, but really this helps to illustrate as an inexperienced student teacher, when they're trying to observe, and that word, is loaded in this sense, but when they're trying to unpick and watch and learn from your teaching, the large part of your practice in schools might not be accessible to them. It might be implicit practice. It might be at times subconscious practice. There might be decisions that you're making on the spot that you're not necessarily aware of, but you are drawing on that phronesis that I've spoken about earlier. So at this point, it is really important to help scaffold this experience, that it's not just the student teacher being sat in the classroom watching with a notebook without actually really getting to grips with a particular focus as part of their observation. So again, our mini guides, you'll see that there is one which is particularly focused on this idea of observation as a learning experience, and a suggested activity here to really make the most of it in a purposeful sense. So, for example, arranging an observation with a particular focus, so that it's narrowed down from a broad learning experience into a particular thing. Asking the student teacher to use this resource, which has a whole host of questions and prompts, and then obviously making sure that there's the opportunity to come together after the event to really think in depth about that learning experience. So at this point, I won't go into too much detail here, but I did just want to make sure that this was highlighted at this stage. This next part of our training is going to focus on reflection. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that reflection is one of those terms that has been bandied around for quite some time and can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Student teachers will, at times we know, instead of reflect, they will recount or describe experiences without actually reflecting on, or rather critically reflecting on their practice, or indeed others' practice to support their own learning. So this quote, despite it being a little old now, is still really relevant and is something which rings true for us here at the APLP. I'm going to move on to this next part with regards to reflection. We know that student teachers can't reflect on everything all at once. So in that line of train of thinking, it's important to point out that these topics might be things that you want them to particularly reflect on and to guide their thinking or focus towards, for example, lesson planning, the learning environment, as adaptive teaching, or making and evaluating pedagogical choices. And please, when the student teachers are reflecting, perhaps in their learning journals or verbally in their fortnightly reflections, which I'll come to talk about, please do encourage that there is a focus to this reflection. And of course, given the opportunity to encounter different experiences, but really that it moves beyond recounting, today I taught so-and-so, it was great, and you know, a very inward-looking description of events. Now, to that end, one of the best ways to do that is obviously to support student teachers by reflecting on learning. And John Hattie in 2012 was writing about this, but we've actually adapted this for the mentor provision, but to really focus on some questions which draw the student teachers thinking toward the learning of learners. So some questions here, again, these might be things that inform comments in learning journals. And of course, there's guidance and exemplars of different comments that are available on SharePoint. But these types of questions are helpful for student teachers to really push their reflection into the realms of learners' learning rather than simply their own performance, if you like, at the front of the classroom or a description that I've discussed already. We know that Eston this year, as part of their annual report, commented exactly that at times student teachers describe the teaching activities, for example, but stop short of evaluating the impact on learners' progress. So again, these questions really push the student teacher in this direction and hopefully support you in that process. I'm going to move on to the topic of feedback because it goes hand in hand with supporting student teachers' reflection. But again, when student teachers are having feedback sessions, whether that's informal conversations with you at the end of the day, or whether it's more formal sessions that have been timetables to discuss progress, for example, there are some questions here that we are really pleased to have seen being adopted by mentors across the partnership fairly naturally now. But instead of perhaps more traditional approaches where there'll be a question asked of the mentee, how did that go? And then simply going into perhaps the mentor's opinion of whatever happened, that the student teacher is an active participant in these discussions and that their thinking is scaffolded by the mentor as part of this process, and particularly with regards to feedback, obviously. So there are, again, some questions here that can support these conversations, and we have a number of videos which are online on our YouTube channel as examples of this. But again, some questions that move beyond perhaps superficial or surface level descriptions of teaching and learning experiences and really go into more depth to push the student teachers thinking into more skeptical approaches, perhaps, when they are making questions. So making assertions, sorry. So again, these questions available on SharePoint area for you. I'm going to touch briefly on the fortnightly reflection process, which is a relatively new process for this year, but will be different from perhaps last year if you had a student teacher and this is your first time supporting them on PTE2. So one of the changes that we've made is that the fortnightly reflections, which have to take place in every student teacher's PTE, is now something in terms of the dates, which is pre-programmed into their professional learning passport. So they have the dates and a template on the PLP, which is programmed in, and this needs to take place, as I said, on a fortnightly basis. It is a cyclical process where a particular topic or problem, I'll come on to talk about that word in a second, is identified by the student teacher and the mentor. And then almost as an intervention, a short-term intervention, something is put into place with regards to the student teacher's practice. And what I mean by that is, for example, a student teacher might trial a new strategy, they might change something in the classroom, they might adapt something in terms of their own practice, and then they will reflect on that at the following fortnightly reflection meeting. There is an illustration of that on this screen, and this is also on the student teacher's PLP area as well. So on each of the templates that they have to complete on a fortnightly basis, you will see this at the top of the template. Now, first of all, as I said, that word problem, obviously in an academic sense, we would talk about problematizing something. So making not in a negative sense, but unpicking a knotty problem that's something that they want to develop. And as I said, that certainly doesn't need to be in any sort of negative sense, but really is something that's far more open and positive. This idea as co-inquirers with you as mentors, that you're embarking upon this process of furthering practice through this process. So that's the first stage. And there are a number of prompts on the template itself which support you as a mentor and the student teacher. So prompts to inform this conversation and guide thinking. And then also agreeing on a planned action. So what's going to be put into place for the purpose of this fortnightly reflection process. Then moving how the student teacher will know if it has an impact, and then thinking more in depth around what's going to come next. And this process, as I said, will move through these stages as part of that fortnightly cycle. I know, as I said, that this is relatively new this year, so I just wanted to give the opportunity for colleagues. If anybody had any questions, particularly with regards to this process, please feel free to ask now. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the last couple of minutes of the training for this afternoon, and with a particular focus on target setting. Again, this has been a focus for us at a strategic level over the last year or so, and senior mentors will be aware that you may have undertaken some quality assurance and enhancement work at network level on ensuring that we are equipping student teachers, or providing student teachers with targets that are appropriate obviously to them, but also realistic and things that they have control over in terms of being able to implement any changes to practice as a consequence. So we focus our targets. Oh, hello. You okay?
Oh, sorry, I'm a bit delayed here. I was just processing. I just wanted to come in on the fortnightly meetings.
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to thank you really, because I feel like this process is extremely clear for us mentors. It's structured. It's a bit of an idiot's guide, really. So that really helps us, because obviously we've got a lot on our plates as well. So we just wanted something very clear, and we gave that in the feedback, and it's nice to see that it's been implemented. And the feedback that I've had of my student as well, he feels that it's very clear. It structures our fortnightly meetings. I like the agreed dates beforehand as well, because you can often get quite lost in a school's diary. There's so much happening, so it's great to have them. I've planned them in. They're written down in the diary, so it's very clear. So just wanted to thank you for that. It makes our jobs much easier. Thank you. Diolch.
Diolch. Thank you so much for that feedback. It's lovely to hear that it's having a positive impact both for you and the student teacher. I'm delighted to have heard that. A lot of work's gone into that from across the partnership. People like yourself feeding things back, and we'll continue to review and evaluate it as we go through. But that sounds really, really positive. So thank you ever so much. Okay, so just moving slightly back to this idea of target setting. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that we asked for targets to be smart, and that won't come as any surprise to you, I'm sure, but with a real focus on making sure that the targets that are given to student teachers are specific, that they are not too long or overly complex, that there's something fairly simple given as a target in a written sense. Something which is measurable or meaningful in terms of their practice, and achievable, that is something, as I mentioned earlier, that they actually have some form of control over actioning in their school. Also, obviously realistic, and then also time bound, so making sure that it is linked to a period of time. Now, with targets, the one thing I suppose it's important to point out at this stage is that we don't expect targets to be ticked off over a fortnightly basis, for example. It's not something necessarily which can be achieved on a week-by-week basis or day-to-day, or in terms of the standards. We don't consider targets to be effective in that sense, and there certainly is no issue with a target taking a little bit longer at times, depending on what it is to achieve. So please don't feel that, for example, in a learning journal or on a fortnightly reflection meeting, that you have to whiz through lots of different topics and everything else. This is really a time to ensure that the targets are purposeful, and so most importantly, realistic, and encompasses all of these parts here. We know that there are some considerations around target setting. I've touched on a couple of those already, but an awareness of how many targets are being set is key. These are some of the findings from senior mentors across the partnership. Is it something which can be measured? How often does it need to be carried out to be considered to be met? A student teacher, for example, if they include some Welsh in a lesson, does that mean that they have met a target around supporting learners' Welsh language skills? There's consideration around that and a discussion to be had. But also whether, for example, as I said, student teachers have control and the opportunity to actually implement some of these things as well. So these were the considerations which were brought back to us by networks across the partnership. And again, a food for thought for you and your mentor teams in schools when setting these various targets for student teachers. I'm going to draw this slightly to a close, but before I do, I wanted to just touch base again with regards to the APLP PTE handbook. Again, this is new this year, so in previous years you may have had individual booklets for each PTE. We've tried to draw all of that into a single document with hyperlinks and all kinds of other things to make it as user-friendly as is possible for you in schools. This is available on SharePoint, but in particular, I wanted to draw attention to the first couple of pages where you will see links to everything really that you could possibly need, whether that's access to SharePoint, if it's a change of contact details in your school, if you wanted to refer one of the student teachers to our wellbeing team. All of this is contained in this handbook, and if anybody for any reason hasn't got access to it, please do either contact your network lead, professional tutor, myself, please, partnership office, please just let us know. I'm more than happy to make sure that you have this. It does have all of the dates in it, as already has been discussed, and hopefully will support you in school in a very, very busy school life. Before I finish, I just wanted to extend one more thank you to you all, because I know full well from my own time in school, but also spending time in school with mentors and teacher educators across the partnership, quite how busy school life is at all times, but particularly at these times. And hopefully you're seeing the benefits of working with us in partnership, and the role of the student teacher in your schools hopefully is a positive one and a positive contribution. But yeah, as I said, just an enormous thank you from us for your continued commitment to the partnership. And I really do hope to see you all towards the end of this year. We're colleagues, myself, Elaine, Dave. We will host senior mentors and mentors from across the partnership in our partnership days in July. And, obviously information about that will come through in our newsletters. But diolch yn galon, thank you ever so much. I'm going to stop with an opportunity for any questions at this stage from you, and if there's anything I can help with.